So an interesting exclusive CBC story there. Is the government doing a good enough job monitoring the exports of these weapons? And should Canada reconsider Saudi arms exports altogether? Joining me now in the foyer of the House of Commons is David Lametti. He's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. Also James Bezan, the Conservative defence critic, and Randall Garrison, the NDP defence critic, who you see in the middle there. Mr. Lametti, I'd like to start with you. Just give me your reaction to the photos of these Canadian-made weapons seemingly found in the hands of Houthi fighters in Yemen. It's not a pretty picture, is it?
Well, we're aware of the story, Terry, and we're obviously concerned. The Minister for International Trade this morning met with officials in the department. She's instructed them to investigate, to make sure that we illuminate all four corners of this story. And moving forward, obviously, we committed ourselves in the election campaign to greater transparency on these kinds of transactions. We intend to do that, and moving forward, that's precisely the direction in which this government wants to go.
But do you have any explanation, though, for why these weapons ended up there in the first place?
Well, no more than what appear in the story, and that's the reason why we're investigating it.
James Bezan, this probably happened during the life of the Conservative government. How do you respond to this news?
Well, of course, we're not happy to see the Houthis having weapons that were sold to the Saudis. You know, there is some concern that maybe they were either sold on the black market, you know, out of Saudi, you know, somehow they captured these arms, and that is the huge issue here is how they got a hold of them. But regardless, you know, we have a trusted ally in Saudi Arabia. We made sure that in all the arms deals they're doing, including with these rifles that are made in Winnipeg, which are used by our Canadian troops as well as the British and other countries, that they are being sold for the purposes of their defense of Saudi Arabia, and they passed all the tests, and Foreign Affairs did a very diligent job in going through the export arms control before they issued the permits.
Randall Garrison, you just heard the Saudis being described as a trusted ally. Do you agree with that?
Well, I guess I'd start by saying, you know, I've worked in conflict zones around the world, and small arms are the scourge of these kind of conflicts. So Canada can and must do better. And whether it's arms that pass through the Saudis or anybody else, we've certainly had a commitment from the Liberals in the campaign to get started on better monitoring of what happens to these small arms. So in the case of the Saudis, if the permit was duly issued, then let's see the human rights report on which it was issued that the Conservatives used. There's no reason that should not become public right now, and we can see whether these arms should have been sold to Saudi Arabia or not.
Mr. Lametti, over the past decade, as you saw in that story, or perhaps you heard it in your earpiece, Canada shipped more than $28 million worth of Canadian-made guns and rifles to Saudi Arabia. So what do you think the government should do with this? I mean, is that just going to continue?
Well, as we've committed to doing in the election campaign, we're going to set up a transparent process. We're not in the business of reopening contracts that have already been signed. During the election campaign, all three parties took the same position on that. But moving forward, we're going to try to improve the process where we can and make it more transparent so that all Canadians can see the criteria and the manner in which these decisions are made.
I sort of expected when I asked you that question to hear something about checking with the Saudis to find out exactly what happened here and how did they lose these weapons. They had a nice export permit, that's all fine, but it's not fine that it fell into the hands of the Houthis, right? So you'd want to know that, wouldn't you?
Well, that's what I had said at the outset, Terry, that the minister has instructed her staff, our staff in the ministry, to get to the bottom of this as best as they can.
All right, not just by looking at the export permit, but by looking at how they lost or how these weapons were seized by the Houthis.
Yeah, we need to find out. We need to find out as best as we can what happened.
James Bezan, a similar question to you. Again, this appears to have all happened under the Conservatives. You repeated, like Mr. Lametti, that this was all done by a proper export permit, but there was no proper export permit to Yemen. There was to Saudi Arabia. That's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, that is the problem, Terry, and of course we want to make sure that Saudi Arabia gets down to the bottom of this, that Canada finds out exactly how Canadian-made sniper rifles ended up in the hands of the Houthis. We want to make sure that when we are selling defensive weapons and military hardware to our allies, like Saudi Arabia, who is a major ally in the Middle East for Canada, as well as other partners in our coalition in the fight against ISIS. So the conflict that's going over in Yemen, yeah, we don't want to see any Canadian weapons falling in the hands of rebel forces that are then being used against our own allies.
So you don't want to see it, but it happens anyway.
It's no different, Terry, than there's always the illicit trade of firearms, and sometimes you can't control things. When situations like this occur, whether they were stolen, whether they overran a border position, or whatever the case may have been, unfortunately, weapons fell into their hands, and we've witnessed this happen in the region and other areas of the world as these types of conflicts evolve.
Randall Garrison, do you think perhaps we ought to worry about the government's devotion to getting to the bottom of this, considering that they didn't even know about this or bother to ask until they saw it on the CBC?
Well, I guess the thing I would say is we need to get busy on this right away. And one of the things this government promised to do that it could do right now is ratify the Arms Trade Treaty. And that would require us to set up better monitoring of the ultimate end use of weapons. The second thing they promised to do was to introduce gun marking immediately, was the word they used, which would allow us to trace the international trade in weapons. So there are some things we can do. There's some real deficiencies in our system right now. The Liberals promised to do that, and I look forward to them carrying out the promise.
Let's just touch, if I may, on the light armored vehicles being sold to Saudi Arabia, Mr. Lametti. Your government said it would not cancel the previous government's contract to provide those trucks, I think they were called by the Liberals, during the campaign. That the contract would not be renewed, though, if human rights conditions are shown to have steadily deteriorated. But you heard Mr. Garrison just now demand to know, where's the human rights report underpinning these sales to Saudi Arabia? Well, where is it?
Well, let me just say, first of all, that we are committed to implementing the arms treaty. Remember that the previous government didn't do it, and we committed to doing it. We started doing it. It's a complicated process. We have to look at every single piece of legislation that touches upon that treaty in order to get that done, but we are going to get that done. We remain committed to it.
Is there any doubt, seriously, that Saudi Arabia's human rights record is appalling?
We know that there are deficiencies in their human rights record. We will continue with a transparent process moving forward to make sure that all the contracts, not just with the Saudis, but with everybody else, accord to general Canadian values, including human rights. We've committed to that. All three parties committed during the election campaign to not reopening the LAV contract with Saudi Arabia. And we are going to do a better job moving forward, we think, by making the process more transparent.
James Bezan, write a reply. Your government is being blamed here, rightly it seems, doesn't it?
No, I think that Foreign Affairs had gone through the process of doing a solid human rights test against all our weapons export permits that we issued for Saudi Arabia. And I'd just say this, that we talked about this issue of the arms trade treaty, and there's no guarantee that that's going to change the situation like we have on the ground right now, where we have guns that were stolen or somehow became in the hands of the Houthis. And if you want to talk about human rights abuses, and we definitely encourage the Liberal government to continue on the dialogue and to express the outrage that we did whenever there was a human rights case in Saudi Arabia. We want them to continue on that path, but also let's not forget that it's Iran that is funding the Houthis, that continue to radicalize Shia in the region and escalate the tensions that we're seeing right now in Yemen.
Can I just give a quick 10 seconds last word to Randall Garrison? Has anything you heard today convince you that we're going to do a better job next time?
Well, what I've heard today and what we've seen in the news today convinces me that we have to do a better job of controlling the export of small arms and limiting the final use of those. And so whatever happened in Yemen right now is a good indication that there's more for us to do.
Thanks all for coming in and discussing this. Thank you, David Lametti, James Bezan, and Randall Garrison.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.